Okay, welcome. This is the first lecture of semester two, and we are moving into the mid to late 19th century, and we're going to talk about realism, which was the dominant literary form in both uh, Europe and America at this time. Um, the novel becomes the most respected, the most studied, the most important literary form as this period continues, and it is the realistic novel that wins out. We have some early novels that are definitely not realistic, some that are very experimental, in fact, nearly postmodern in their stylings, but it is the reasonably realistic novel that wins out. When we think of Jane Austen or Charles Dickens or Thackeray or Mark Twain or Henry James or the Brontes, for the most part, it is realism that dominates. And it comes to dominate more and more as the 19th century goes on. Realism comes to be the default state and form of the novel, and because of that, it becomes the form that is most respected and it is considered by the powers that be the most appropriate, important, and artistic. It arrives as a dominant style, and the novel becomes the preeminent literary form at the same cultural moment that sees this massive expansion of education and especially literacy far beyond the moneyed and culturally powerful elite who had previously been educated. For the first time, the middle classes and working classes have the ability to preserve the literary and artistic forms that they prefer. And because the elite see themselves as better than the middle classes and working classes, this leads to a split between high art, which is supported by, promoted by the cultural elite, and is the stuff that people should like, and popular art, the art that is generally preferred by the masses, by the middle and working class. Realism is the dominant form in both cases through the end of the 19th century, and realism dominates high literary art through the 19th and 20th centuries, and for the most part still dominates literature today, even more so than other art forms. Uh, this period that we're going to talk about marks its initial ascension. As we talk about this initial push towards realism in literature, we're going to talk about three different forms of realism. Basic general realism will be represented by William Dean Howells, who is in the nice fancy fur-lined coat on your left as you look at the screen. In the middle, hopefully at least a somewhat familiar face, is Mark Twain. Mark Twain is certainly the preeminent, at least the preeminent novelist, if not the preeminent literary figure of the entire history of the United States to this point, if we had to pick just one. And he represents a strain of realism that we will call regionalism, or at the time was called local color. And finally, on the right, you have Stephen Crane, and you'll notice he's significantly younger than the other two, and he represented a form that was uh, the shortest lived and the latest to start in time. It started the latest in the 19th century, called Naturalism, which was another subgenre of realism. Now, William Dean Howells is our example of generalized realism, and when he wrote about realism, he talked about representing the world the way it really is and the power of stories that showed people how life really works. Howells believed this was most artistic because the real world is more beautiful and stranger than, truth is stranger than fiction, things like that. And he also believed in the moral rightness of realism, that we, meaning society, could make the world a better place and teach ourselves to be better by embracing realism in literature and art, which would show us the world the way it really was. And then when we saw the problems, we could fix them. Editha is a wonderful example of this slightly moralistic, slightly preachy realism that Howells preferred. And it is especially good to mark the transition from the Romantic or Gothic period because it is primarily an attack on the kind of over emotional, idealistic thinking that realists saw as the epitome of romanticism. And while I don't think it is the epitome of romanticism, it certainly is romanticism's great weakness. Um, so Editha deals with that. Stephen Crane was a journalist and reporter, wrote for a number of publications, and he also wrote fiction and poetry. His most famous piece is The Red Badge of Courage, a short novel about the Civil War, and A Mystery of Heroism is a short story that he wrote, also about the Civil War. This this particular story is an example of the subgenre of naturalism. Now, in the mid 19th century, Charles Darwin publishes The Origin of Species and then The Descent of Man, and begins to argue for the world and humankind and all life as the product of completely scientific natural law without any supernatural force or being at the head of it. Um, and his ideas were tremendously powerful. They had a huge impact on all sorts of disciplines. People tried to embrace it, and etc. The amazing advancements provided by technology and science made some literary figures want to move literature and art in the direction of technology and science. They wanted it to be scientific. Naturalism, like many of the various experimental literary styles that would follow, was an attempt to be even more realistic than the realists. The idea being that if Darwin is right, and the naturalists assume that he is, that mankind is the product of his genes and his environment. That human beings are the product of their genes and their environment. In either case, they are dominated by forces beyond their control. And free will is mostly an illusion, or is at least very, very limited. Naturalism, Emile Zola, who was a French naturalist, said that we wanted to move literature so close to science that you could throw a character in and into a situation, and if you told me his background and his family, I could tell you exactly how he would respond, and that literature would lead us to a true understanding of human beings by creating these kind of experiments. Um, we'll be looking at the example of this type of thinking through A Mystery of Heroism. The third type of realism that we'll be looking at is another subgenre, and it was called regionalism nowadays, and at the time was often referred to as local color. And there were local color writers all over the country. Uh, in New England, there were a number of them. It was particularly well known for having local color writers. The Old West was known for it, and the South. And the two greatest local color writers were Mark Twain and Kate Chopin, and Mark Twain, the greatest of them all. And his writing embraces the dialect and the detailed culture and society of the pre war South, and Twain uses that and his own sense of humor to comment on society as it is now. Um, his greatest works and most famous works are all examples of this kind of very specific study of the region he called home.